Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I will be bringing you a review of The Immortals by Jordanna Brodsky. This is a book that I read in February and I mentioned it in my wrap-up as saying I rated it a 3 out of 5 stars, but it was still one of my biggest disappointments and least favorite of the month. I initially had absolutely no intention of even reading this book. I had seen it popped up, but the entire premise made me roll my eyes. However, on the Barnes & Noble science fiction and fantasy blog, a reviewer talked about how it reminded them very much of American gods, except obviously involving Greek mythology in New York City, and I was like, oh, maybe I should give this book a go. A friend of mine had the audiobook, I borrowed it, and spent basically a workday listening to it. And up to about pretty much exactly the 50% mark, I was banking that I figured I was gonna rate this a 4 out of 5. Did it have problems? Sure. But was it fun? Absolutely. And then we hit the 50% mark and everything went downhill. The story of the Immortals is that the Greek gods were real, but centuries have passed and nobody really believes in them anymore, so they don't necessarily have all the powers that they used to have. They are now, for some reason, all hanging out in New York City, with the exception of Zeus. He's like off crazy in a cave somewhere. Yeah, it's kind of giving lip service and it's setting you up for sequels. And we follow predominantly Artemis, or she likes to go by Selene. For those of us who know Greek mythology, Selene was the actual moon in Greek mythology. So here's a fun little rundown on Greek mythology. Greek mythology has a lot of gods. So when we think of Apollo and Artemis, the divine twins, two of the Olympians, Apollo was the god of the sun and Artemis was the goddess of the moon, but they weren't the actual sun and moon. Helios was the sun, Selene was the moon. So you have a god and goddess of the moon and sun respectively, but then you also actually have the moon and sun. It can seem a little confusing, just roll with it. So the fact that Artemis is going by Selene or Selene, which is how it was pronounced in the audiobook, not that surprising, it kind of fits with the myth there. So what is she doing? She doesn't actually have a job. She used to be a cop back in like the 1920s, I think they reference. But now she's effectively kind of her own private investigator and she's not paid. Let's just examine how I don't understand how she's paying for her apartment. She has a horrific vision dream of a woman being very brutally murdered, and then next thing you know, oh my god, turns out that was real. So Artemis is on the case to solve all of these multiple murders that are occurring throughout the city of New York and that all involve a serious amount of violence towards women. The first one is without question the most horrific. It involves organs and destruction and is nasty. I will say, yeah, I was kind of rolling my eyes at the premise in the beginning, but I was like, this might work. This might be entertaining. You never know. I was promised American gods, so I mean, this could be good. Because ultimately, this isn't a very innovative premise. The idea that the gods are real and they're running around in modern-day United States? Yeah, Rick Riordan's been on that train for a while, so this isn't new to us. It's what an author does with an already well-established concept that makes books like these so much fun. Or makes them suck. Either way. And again, up until the 50% mark, I thought actually Brodsky was doing a really good job. She'd done research not only into classical myth, but into Hellenic culture, and that's what I found particularly interesting. Besides Artemis, the other predominant player is a classics professor named Theo. Yeah, I know. Theo. We get it. But let's just talk about Theo. Theo is bae. He was my favorite character in the entire book, with maybe the exception of Hermes, who was pretty funny and I kinda dug him. Here's the thing about Theo. Theo is a classics professor, which means you're gonna use him to info dump so much of your classical information, which, yeah, Brodsky does. However, I will have to say one of the best info dumps that does, and it is an info dump, that occurs within the novel is after Theo has gone to the cops, and he starts literally at point-blank range spitting out a lecture on the Eleusinian Mysteries to this New York City cop, who's looking at him like he's bonkers. The Eleusinian Mysteries are, well, first off, kind of a mystery. We really don't know anything about them. We know that they were a festival to Demeter and to Persephone, and that they were super highly secretive, and we've never really recovered any serious evidence detailing what exactly went on in them. So what Brodsky has done is taken what little various pieces of information that could be found throughout history and kind of conflated them together to sort of make her own. I can't totally hate her for that because is the Eleusinian Mysteries. Nobody really knows anything. And the fact that Theo is actually just spitting this point blank range out at a cop is very entertaining. And Theo just becomes an interesting character because the first victim is his ex-girlfriend. And she was actually engaged to his co-worker, and he was still kind of, well, a little bit in love with his ex. So this is a very personal thing for him. And actually, Artemis initially makes him the prime suspect before she realizes that, yeah, no, this guy he's not a murderer. He's very clearly not our murderer. But I like Theo because he is pretty much the only, like, mortal we spend a serious amount of time with. So it's easier to relate to him than to any of the gods because they're not human. And I shouldn't expect them to behave like humans. Theo, on the other hand, is human. He apparently looks a bit like Luke Skywalker, which I'm not making up, it's a throwaway line in there, in the book, and I just started howling with laughter because then I was just imagining babyface Mark Hamill running around, and it was a very funny image, I'm not gonna lie. But the great thing about Theo is that he's not really great at interpersonal skills, he's very much an academic and kind of locked in his own head, and that does make him a little kind of just like, oh puppy, you're adorable, and you're so smart. As for Artemis, she's not human. And this is something that if you're not able to get over that, you're gonna be really turned off by Artemis. I eventually got turned off by her, but for very different reasons other than, like, she's not human. And at the beginning of it, she's actually a fairly great protagonist because there's just enough of a cold distance with her where she kind of looks at humans and she is apart from them. And that is established really, really well. And I thought it was actually utilized really well, in this case, for most of the book. Till the back third. But I will say something that I was a little disappointed by, and maybe this is just me. I thought that the fact that Artemis was going to be our protagonist was a great chance to have a protagonist who was on the asexual spectrum. Artemis is pretty much a divisive figure. She kind of represents the ultimate dichotomy of the Greek mythology, and that, yeah, she's pretty kick-ass, goddess of the hunt, and really, seriously, like, badass. And she can be this great feminist icon in relation to that for choosing never to marry and all that. But there's the fact that it's like, oh, she didn't marry, she stayed, like, pure and therefore, like, good to the ancient Greeks. And so you have to be able to divorce yourself from one or the other perspectives. It's really hard to try and blend them both together. In my mind, I always looked at Artemis as basically asexual. She wasn't interested in guys, she wasn't interested in girls, she really just didn't care all that much. With the big exception being Orion. Sure, there are a bunch of different versions of Orion, but the one that I've heard the most frequently is that she and Orion pretty much came together as almost like soulmates. They were both intense hunters, they really got off on it, and there was the potential for the romantic element, and she clearly developed a deep bond with him. And then Apollo got, like, weirdly jealous, and the version of the myth that I heard most often was that he then sent this great scorpion out and killed Orion. Artemis didn't like that, but that is why Orion hangs up in the stars and why he and the scorpion are never in the sky together. But again, this was a great chance to have a character who was basically asexual. No romance needed, because Artemis doesn't need somebody. When I take Orion into account, this puts her kind of smack dab in the middle of the asexual spectrum. She kind of becomes like gray A/demisexual, something which I think would have been really interesting and incredible and could have been utilized without needing to have a huge discussion on it. Like, it's just, that's it. She doesn't care. She's not interested. Boom. Done. Instead, I get insta-love with Theo. Theo, who is still bae, and whose relationship with Artemis is awful. Because here's the thing. I can actually understand Theo's weird attraction to Artemis. There's a great line from the 1998 film Elizabeth that's said by Francis Walsingham, who's being played by Geoffrey Rush, where he says,
"All men need something greater than themselves to look up to and worship. They must be able to touch the divine here on Earth."
So what I got from that was that Theo is really drawn to Artemis because she's not human. She is the divine. She's immortal. She's a goddess. There's a sense of being enthralled by her, even when you don't quite understand what's going on. And who better to be enthralled by a Greek god than a guy who is a classics nut? Like, this just made sense in my head. Artemis, on the other hand, made no sense. She basically falls headfirst for this guy for really no good reason, and their relationship had me gagging by the end of the book. It was so stupid. And the reason it really didn't work is because it took away from the impact of the finale. The finale involves the fact that, oh surprise, Orion is actually back from the dead. Let's be real, I saw Orion coming back for the entire book. I actually had initially pegged that Theo was a reincarnation of Orion, and that in my head would have perfectly explained Artemis's attraction to him and his, like, super being drawn to her as well. But no, because that would have made too much gory damn sense. Instead, Orion comes back and he's the ultimate villain, and he's like, Artemis, I'm doing this for you so I can give you all of your divine powers back. And I'm like, Well, now that I've set up your initial downfall, and it really doesn't matter what happens to Theo at this point because Artemis will just bring him back if you kill him. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about death in Greek mythology. I got a couple bones to pick with this book, especially how it deals with death and its relation to Greek mythology. First off, the gods did not screw around with death. They really didn't. It was not a thing you screwed with. There are a couple instances in mythology in which Zeus kind of interferes and death is sort of reversed, and there are a couple various myths where death gets involved and it's a little more loose than you think. However, in general, no, the gods didn't screw around with death. They really didn't. Again, Zeus did it a couple times, it's good to be the king. Other than that, messing with death is basically a massive fuck you to not only Hades, but to these even more primordial characters called the Moirai. The Moirai, or the Fates as we might also know them. No, not quite those, but you get the picture. They were incredibly powerful. They were said to be some of the only things that Zeus genuinely revered to the point of fear and who he really didn't want to screw with, because you don't mess with fate, the fates, and you don't mess with death. So the fact that this book treats death like it's no big deal, the gods can just bring you back as long as they've got your body. No, it's just not how it works. So the fact that we kill Theo, I was sitting there just counting the seconds in the audiobook going, how long is it going to take him to bring him back? I'm not even worried about this. And the fact that I wasn't worried is the worst sign. Because despite the fact that I cared about Theo and I really liked him, he was pretty much the only character I cared about by this point. The fact that I wasn't worried about the fact that he died says a lot about how basically lame this finale was. But while we're on the topic of death, let's just talk about how badly the Lord of the Dead is treated in this novel. At the 50% mark, which is the point where this book went entirely downhill for me, Artemis goes to the underworld. And she meets Hades and Persephone in a sequence that is so offensive to both of those mythological characters. I was flabbergasted at how bad it was and how offensive it was. Because here's the thing, I ended up writing an entire blog post entitled The People versus Hades because I was basically so shocked that this was even happening. Hades gets a bad rap in modern adaptation enough as it is. You don't need to portray him as this weird, power-hungry dick with a wife who's either completely off her rails or is like some creepy Stepford housewife, except worse. I didn't quite understand what we were going for here, other than to basically be rude as fuck to Hades. And why? Why are we so rude to Hades? The easy answer would be that humanity fears death, so it's really easy to demonize and vilify death. Except Hades wasn't death. That's a god called Thanatos, and that's why Marvel has Thanos, and he thinks that he's in a relationship with death. Yeah, Marvel doing their freaking mythology better than you. Not sure if that's a good sign or not. Especially when you claim to have done all of this research. You claim to have gone to Greece, to have gone to Italy, to have seen these places, to have done all this research, and to fuck up so royally? To do something this offensive to not only one, but two gods? And then to have the shit show that is that finale where I have no tension because you've basically already told me it doesn't matter, that death is no big deal. Again, another massive fuck you to Hades. What? I'm left astounded by this novel, and of course you're probably then wondering why I rated it a 3 out of 5 as opposed to something like a 1 or 2. Trust me, I was very torn, and I'm still torn. I don't know whether or not I want to go back and retroactively lower my rating, because every time I think about it, I remember the fact that I actually really liked Theo and that the front half really was so strong. The characters were fun, I was curious about what was going on, the mystery was good enough, even though I was pretty sure I was figuring it out, that, you had something there. And then that scene in the underworld happened, and I got a real taste of what Brodsky was really doing, and it was awful. It's genuinely awful. So despite the fact I gave this a 3 out of 5, and right now I'm seriously considering retroactively changing it, I can't recommend this book. I can't. Because I'm so offended by so many of the things that happen in it. And there were so many missed opportunities, and the fact that it's a series just makes more bile rise to my mouth. I would never read the rest of this series. No matter how much I like Theo, no matter how much I thought Hermes' snark was on point, if a little offensive at times. There were a lot of, hey, you ain't popped your cherry yet jokes. They started out funny, And then they ended up being really uncomfortable. And I say they're funny because I spend a lot of time around guys and I have younger brothers and I've heard jokes like these all the time. So they don't faze me. I guess I have a thick skin. I couldn't read the rest of this series because while I think Theo is actually pretty fantastic, his relationship with Artemis makes me want to vomit. If only Theo and Artemis had stayed partners in crime, I think this could have worked. If Theo had been a reincarnation of Orion, I think it could have worked even better. That would have been so interesting. One, you explain away the insta-love between the two of them, and you explain Artemis's draw to him because she's reconnecting with a soul, an old soul, something that was very important to her. And not only that, you take Theo beyond the realm of just being enthralled by a goddess to being like, we are actually soulmates because I'm a reincarnation of your basically only other soulmate. Romantic soulmate, that is. It is true that soulmates can come in all shapes and forms and they don't have to be romantic. They can be platonic, they can be familial, whatever. That potential wasn't seized. Same with the potential of having an asexual heroine who frankly was just interested in having a partner in crime and didn't need romance, didn't need no man or woman to basically do her thing. And it all came down to being about the men, which is really disappointing when you're using Artemis. If you wanted to have it end up being all about the men, you should have done freaking Aphrodite. I'm still so upset by this book. And I don't think I would be this hypercritical if all of my, like, classicist pet peeve buttons and just, like, no buttons had not been pressed. And then, like, a little bit. And then once you hit the 50% mark, it was, like, hitting the no button and just hanging there. I was like, this went so far downhill. I don't understand what happened. Maybe if they'd just stayed out of the underworld, I could have been a little nicer to this book. That's it for me today, you guys, and so until next time, cheers.